Hello, welcome. My name is Todd Tabutis, and I am the director of the Art Museum of West Virginia University. It's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker on behalf of both the Art Museum and the School of Art and Design here at WVU. We're co-presenting tonight's program. First, I want to let everybody know that live captioning is available. If you see the closed caption icon at the bottom of your screen and click that, you should be able to activate live captioning. The other thing is that we are not using the chat feature tonight for Q&A, but we are using the Q&A function. So not chat, but Q&A. My colleague, Heather Harris, Educational Programs Manager at the Art Museum, is lurking in the background, and she will moderate the Q&A as we go. If she can answer some questions, she will. Otherwise, we'll wait for a fully moderated question and answer session with the speaker at the end. So now I would like to invite Dr. Rebecca Senft to join me on screen. Hello, Dr. Senf.
Hello.
Dr. Senf is joining us from Tucson, Arizona. She is the Chief Curator at the Center for Creative Photography at the University of Arizona. The Center for Creative Photography, or the Center, or CCP as it's sometimes called, was started in 1975 and began with the archives of 5 photographers, one of whom was Ansel Adams, who is the subject of tonight's talk. Dr. Senf knows the career of Ansel Adams very well. She studied the early work of his career as a graduate student at Boston University. She researched and wrote her dissertation on this period of his life, which became the core of a book, Making a Photographer, the early work of Ansel Adams. Yes, please hold it up. I regret I forgot to bring it and show it, sorry. That book was published early this year in 2020 by Yale University Press and the Center for Creative Photography. We had invited Dr. Senf to speak here in Morgantown in person well before the COVID-19 global pandemic began. And while we are very sorry that that could not happen in person, there are some things that the virtual realm does allow us to do, which is to have her come to us, no matter where you are in the world right now, and share her research and expertise about Ansel Adams with us tonight. One thing I do want to mention is that the Art Museum is very fortunate to have 4 prints by Ansel Adams in the collection. They were generously donated by Anne and Glenn Heiner. 2 of them are on display right now in Blaney House, which is the home of the president of WVU. So with that, what I would like to do is invite Dr. Senf to share the screen. When she's done, we'll pop back in for Q&A. So welcome, Becky.
Thanks, Todd. And I want to thank the Art Museum of West Virginia University and the West Virginia School of Art and Design for having me. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. It would have been fun to be there and celebrate the book and talk with you all in person, but hopefully we'll be able to do some questions and still get a little sense of some interaction. So today I'm going to be talking about my new publication. Let's see, and I just advanced the slide there. The book is called Making a Photographer, the Early Work of Ansel Adams. And as Todd mentioned, I began my research on Ansel Adams back in 2003 when I was working at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and was in graduate school at Boston University. And that resulted in a major Ansel Adams exhibition in 2005, Ansel Adams from the Lane Collection. I continued my research following the exhibition and submitted a doctoral dissertation about Adams's early years, which was in 2007, which is also the year I began at the Center for Creative Photography, where the Ansel Adams archive is here in Tucson. And then over the last 2 or 3 years, I rewrote the dissertation for publication in the form of a book. And so that's what we'll be talking about today. The basic premise of the book is investigating Adams's early period, and in particular, how he got from pictures like the one on the left, which was made around 1920, a close-up of trees in Yosemite Valley, to pictures like the one on the right, which is from 1958, called Aspens, Northern New Mexico, or for people who know Adams, sometimes we call this horizontal aspens, in contrast to another picture he made that same day, which is vertically oriented and just features aspen trunks. But you can see between these 2 pictures what a dramatic contrast there is from early in his career to the later work, which is very typical of his later production and might to all of you look like an Ansel Adams. So the earlier picture has less contrast. It's a more intimate framing of a scene. He's closer in proximity to the trees and to the valley wall. Whereas in the picture, Aspen's Northern New Mexico, he's using greater contrast, really dramatic light to get across his feelings about nature and his experiences in the wilderness. Another way to see the same kind of contrast is through a pair of prints that the Heiners gave and belong to the Art Museum of West Virginia University there in Morgantown. And so what we're seeing here on the left is a picture called Frozen Lake and Cliffs from 1932. And I'm contrasting it with another picture from the Heiners, Winter Sunrise Sierra Nevada from Lone Pine, which is from 1944. And you can see that in the earlier picture, Adams is experimenting with things like abstraction and the use of patterns to sort of come forward in the picture rather than a legible subject. So it can sometimes be hard to read this picture, but the snow in the foreground is on the surface of the frozen lake, and in the immediate foreground, we're seeing the reflection of that cliff in the glassy water. And then in the background, a cliff face that's coming directly down into the lake. So in contrast, in the picture from 1944, we see again a more typical Ansel Adams, an iconic picture that has almost this primordial quality, like we're seeing the earth when it was new. And we see him using great contrast, a beautiful expanse of sky, the use of light to highlight that horse, teeny tiny in the foreground, and to create a sense of depth and drama in the landscape. So we'll get into some of these characteristics more in depth. So what I'm going to do with the talk today is focus on 5 aspects or ideas in the book that are places where my scholarship contributed to our understanding of Ansel Adams. So these are new elements that are represented in this book that weren't part of how we understood Ansel Adams before. And so we're going to start with the first one here with this picture, Tetons and the Snake River. And so the first thing that is new in my book that I want to talk about is that when I talk about a typical Ansel Adams or a characteristic Ansel Adams, interestingly, no one had ever defined what qualities or what elements made up a typical Ansel Adams before now. And so that seemed like a really important place to start. How do we describe or define what makes a typical Ansel Adams picture? And for those of you young art historians out there, this is a big part of what art historians do, is bring language to visual phenomena so that we understand them and can discuss them and in fact can disagree about them or have new ways of understanding over time as new scholars challenge the things that previous scholars have said. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about this picture, and then I'm going to read from the book so you get a sense of the flavor of the text itself. But what I want to talk about with this picture is the way that Adams is using these visual characteristics to convey his emotional ideas about the picture through to a viewer. And he's really trying to use the photograph in this stylistic language to persuade us of something. And in this case, of the importance of these wilderness experiences. And so he's doing this through 4 characteristics. One is a panoramic sweep of the landscape, so a vast, broad view of the landscape. Another is an omniscient perspective. So he's choosing a viewpoint where we feel like we're seeing a God's eye view, the most perfect way to see the landscape. He's also using a broad range of gray tones. And those of you who study photography may have heard of the zone system. So he's using the zone system to get a wide range from white to black and all of the grays in between. And then finally, he's using light and weather effects in order to evoke a sense of grandeur, of awe, of drama. And so I'm going to read from this passage and I'll talk about those elements as we go through. All right. Using the Tetons and the Snake River as an example, it is possible to describe these stylistic elements that Adams brought together to support his communicative goal. This photograph visually expresses the transformative potential of experiences in nature and the value of wilderness as an intrinsic good. In sum, it presents a heroic vision of the American wilderness as an invaluable asset to its citizens. Adams chose a vantage point that facilitated a panoramic view of the Teton mountain range with the winding Snake River. The picture includes a swath of cloud-filled sky and distant mountains with patches of bright snow. In the mid-range, the silvery river curves through tree-covered banks. With little immediate foreground, Adams created a perspective that suggests his omniscient grasp of the scene, and as such implies that what is presented is made from the ideal position and is the best, or perhaps the only way this particular vista should be seen. It is a stylistic choice that imparts authority and gravity to the picture and confers importance on the subject. Adams favored landscape views that featured visible weather, such as snowstorms, billowing clouds, and rain. In some instances, his photographs include a wide band of sky to accommodate clouds, emphasizing an atmospheric expanse. In other cases, clouds and mist appear around landforms, creating depth within the three-dimensional space and helping to define and shape the appearance of the land itself, as with this image of clearing winter storm. One advantage of weather for Adams was its ephemeral nature. Clouds, rain, and snow are all temporal elements, and they impart a sense of transience and motion to Adams's necessarily still frames. In the Tetons and the Snake River, the sky glows behind dark storm clouds, and the left-hand portion of the mountains is bathed in sunlight, as is the surface of the Snake River, causing it to shimmer within the darker surrounding territory. Because of the changeability of the light and weather depicted, the viewer is aware that the scene Adams captured must not have looked like this for long, and indeed, will never look exactly like this again. Thus, the viewer can both appreciate the magical qualities of spectacular clouds and illuminating rays as inspiring features of the natural world, and also attribute to Adams the ability to perceive and record just the right moment when the scene offered this exquisite combination of visual effects. A key component of Adams's mature style is an operatic treatment of his subject, a desire to heighten the dramatic qualities of the scene and create a photographic work of art that is both widely comprehensible and spectacular. In some instances, it is achieved by his use of viewpoint. At other times, it is light or weather effects that convey that engaging sense of drama. In some pictures, such as the Snake River and the Tetons, it is the use of powerful shifts in contrast, glittering passages of light interspersed with or appearing alongside areas of dense shadow or darkness. Adams's use of heightened contrast gives his images an engaging forcefulness, making his artworks bold and serious. The perception that the landscape is imbued with drama creates an expectation that the situation is not static and that viewers are observing a fleeting moment within an evolving situation. Adams's use of operatic and awe-inspiring qualities in his prints plays upon the expectations of viewers. The Tetons and the Snake River as a work of photographic art is impactful because the actual scene, when observed by a typical national park tourist, does not look as it does in Adams's picture. His complete set of skills in making the negative and the print coalesce to create an artwork that surpasses people's real-life experience, presenting an idealized, heroic version of what really exists, but one still rooted in the appearance of the scene. In so doing, Adams's artworks convey not what he saw, but what he felt. Perhaps more importantly, they convey what Adams hoped his viewers would feel when faced with these landscapes that were deeply meaningful and inspiring to him. So that's the first point, this idea of defining how Adams is using a photographic stylistic language to create the pictures that we think of as looking like Ansel Adams. Now, the next point in my book that I think hasn't been addressed before is the transition from Adams as a 14-year-old boy who first picks up a camera in Yosemite Valley to the very capable and experienced mountaineer that he becomes in his early 20s and really exercises those hiking and backpacking and mountaineering skills through much of his early life. And the reason that this is so significant is that mountaineering experience, that experience of being in the wilderness and sleeping under the stars and camping and exploring, all of that informs both his photography and ultimately his environmentalism and activism. So I'm going to walk us through this idea. So here we're seeing Ansel Adams at about age 14. He's holding a box Brownie camera, and this is a very simple form of camera, but he was an only child, and in 1916, when he was 14, he convinced his parents that their summer vacation should be in Yosemite Valley. They lived in San Francisco, and so it was a bit of a trek to go eastward to Yosemite Valley, but he persuaded his parents that this is what they should do. And so while he was in the valley, he experienced it much like tourists did in that day. He was a kid, he was learning how to hike and explore, but he was really very tied to his parents and to the camp life. But we can see in his pictures that he made from that experience that we're seeing here on the screen, that he's already beginning to think about what he can do with photography, what kind of framing he can use, what kind of lighting he can use. He's experimenting with making a composition in photography. So these are all organized in this childhood album that lives at the Center for Creative Photography in the Ansel Adams Archive. The pictures are all organized geographically, so around each of the landforms in the valley. And so here we're seeing one of two pages about Half Dome, the most prominent of the landforms in Yosemite. And we can see within these pictures his experimentation. So the picture right in the middle, he's exploring backlighting. In the picture on the upper left, he's got Half Dome slid all the way to the right. In the picture on the lower right, Half Dome is all the way in the lower right corner of the composition. So we can see him playing with this. In other examples, we can see him playing with foreground. What happens if you put cabins in the foreground, or trees, or the Merced River? So he's really just beginning. This is a great starting point for him. And then we also have wonderful correspondence by Adams, including this letter from that very first summer that he was in Yosemite Valley. And for you young scholars out there, this is an example of the kind of primary source material that I was able to use in my research. So rather than just relying on what Adams said later in his life about what his career was like, I could go right back to the original letters and see what he said at the time in his own voice. And so I'd like to read just a short passage of this letter because it's so charming. And I'm going to begin reading on that first left-hand page, the second paragraph where it says, "A couple of days ago. A couple of days ago, we went to Mirror Lake to see the sunrise. We then took the North Dome Trail up the Tenaya Canyon. It is a 21-mile trail, and we had the pleasure of walking about 1/4 of it. About 4 or 5 days ago, I went to the top of Yosemite Falls and Yosemite Point. I came back on fast time, covering 5 miles in 1 hour and 5 minutes. I have taken more than 85 good pictures. I have learned to swim and play pool and croquet. We expect to go to Glacier Point on Wednesday, either by the 11-mile trail or the Ledge Trail. We will go on the former on horses. Hoping that you are well and expecting to hear from you soon, I am Ansel Adams." So here we get Adams writing to his Aunt Mary, who gave him his first book about Yosemite Valley. And he's talking about all the things they're doing. And you can see that photography is just one element of that, equal to learning to play pool or croquet or swim. And that he's moving through the terrain, but what he's paying attention to is how fast he's moving and how many miles he's covering. So this is really a very early phase in his thinking about what it means to experience the landscape or experience the wilderness. This is a portrait of Adams from about 1932, so now he's much older, around 30. But I'm going to read a passage that's a little bit earlier, from around 1920. And the thing about this 1920 passage is that it gives us a sense of how rapidly, just over a period of 4 years, he's gone from this childhood enthusiasm about covering lots of miles on fast time to thinking much more about what that experience is. And he's become much more accomplished. So here I'm going to read about a trip that he took with someone named Harold Seville. And this is a period of time where Adams is going out on extended backpacking trips with a number of different mentors, Sierra Club members, sometimes just one other person, sometimes a whole party. And this is a way that he's expanding his knowledge about becoming a mountaineer and learning from all of these mentors. But I'm going to read to you about a trip where he's out with a peer, and he's actually the most knowledgeable person. Among the extended camping trips Adams took during his first summer as Sierra Club custodian was one to Little Yosemite Valley, just east of Yosemite Valley proper, with his friend Harold D. Seville. With his father's help, Adams had purchased a mule, Mistletoe, allowing for a more comfortable excursion into the mountains. Quote, "As I said before, he will be indispensable when long trips are considered, and we will then be able to pack a more enjoyable amount and variety of provisions and take greater pleasure out of our meals, more milk, more canned fruit, more everything than if we packed on our backs," end quote. Unlike past summers when Holman was the mountaineering mentor and Adams the acolyte, Adams was now the leader, equipped with burro and know-how. Seville wrote to Adams's father, Charles, after their 9-day trip, boasting of his friend's abilities. Quote, "Well, it was a wonderful trip, and Ansel is a master of the art of camping and a mountaineer of real ability and self-reliance. You don't need to worry about him, for he is a real out-of-doorsman and a dandy pal all around," end quote. Later that same month, Adams and Seville took a 3-day trip to Red Peak, which included an exhausting climb, the technical details of which Adams recounted to his father. Quote, "We gained the summit after one of the most tiring climbs that I have ever experienced. Our camp was about 7 miles from the west base of the peak, all uphill, a 30% grade and a lot of the way through snow. Arriving at the base of the peak, we were confronted by 3,000 feet of snow and ice. As the altitude of the peak is 11,700 feet and the western base about 8,500 feet, you can imagine what the ascent meant, carrying camera, rope, brass tube, lunch, etc. We reached the top at about 2:30, stayed on the summit a half an hour, and returned to camp. On the way down, we glissaded many hundreds of feet and saved much time and reached camp about 6:30. The trip up through the Illilouette was not easy, and that, coupled with the ascent the next day, was very fatiguing. So I must admit I was quite all in and glad to crawl into my sleeping bag last night. I feel wonderful now and ready to do it all over again if necessary, but it sure was some climb." So here we get a sense that he's taking on much harder things. He's more knowledgeable. He's talking about altitudes. He's using some mountaineering terms. And when he refers to the brass tube, they were bringing a place for a record for people who summited the peak to leave notation that they'd been there. So he's actually functioning within this mountaineering culture to create an established tube up on the top of the peak where others can record their ascents. So then here's another picture from Adams around this time. We see him with his Sierra Club cup on his belt. And the Sierra Club was a really important part of how Adams gained his experience and his knowledge about the mountains. The Sierra Club's approach was a very learned one to being out in the wilderness. So you were learning about the trees, the flora, the fauna, the geology of the area, how it came into being. Everything was referred to by its name. So you knew the map and the geography as well. And so these were all components of how Adams is learning at the time. And he's making pictures like this one. So still in this earlier style where the form is more important than the emotional content. And he's experimenting with the shades of gray, with the shapes and the lines, the way that the shape of the tree in the foreground on the left mimics that V-shaped cut out of the peak all the way to the right. So he's really playing still in a more modernist or formalist style. But I have another passage that I want to read that tells us a bit more about what these camping and hiking experiences were like. So in this case, rather than using letters to get information, there is a wonderful journal from Joseph N. LeConte, one of the people that Adams camped with. And LeConte kept a daily journal. And that provides wonderful details about what the experience of these extended, sometimes multi-week trips into the high country were like. So I'm going to read you just a paragraph here that gives some of the granular detail from LeConte's journal. In the mid-1920s, when Adams joined multi-week packing trips with the Joseph N. LeConte and his children, Joseph and Helen, his photographic activities are documented in the elder LeConte's journals. These journals give a wonderful sense of high country camping. Each day, LeConte wrote roughly 4 lines summarizing the day. He would talk about the food that was eaten or the acquisition of additional food. So for instance, quote, wonderful pan of biscuits on return to camp, end quote. The weather, he mentioned lightning, hail, rain. He mentioned that it was hot and sultry one day, overcast, perfect clear, cold cutting wind, and one evening, quote, a tremendous rainstorm that swept the head of Bubbs Creek and the most magnificent rainbow I have ever seen spanning the West Fayette, end quote. He talked about activities, including things like loafing, fishing, washing, swimming, bathing, walking, climbing, tramping, resting, writing letters, packing, and botanizing. He would talk about the trails and the condition of the trails, the discovery of new routes, and the logistics of moving the mules because they needed easier paths than the hikers. He would talk about wildlife, which most often meant mosquitoes, but on one case did include a bear. And then he would also talk about the many people that they encountered out in the wilderness, such as in one case, quote, met Smith of Standard Oil and party, end quote. And then on just one occasion, he mentioned an earthquake, quote, after we were all in bed, we had an earthquake, heard the roar from the east, then a sharp movement of earth under our beds, end quote. The 1925 journal in particular makes mention several times when Adams was off photographing, as on July 6, quote, the 3 were off again for Kearsarge this cold, clear morning at 7. I simply loafed about and killed time till Helen and Joseph returned at 1. A perfect day, clear as a bell. Ansel stayed on pass to get proper lighting effects, end quote. Although brief, this mention suggests Adams's investment in each photograph, his awareness of the impact of changing light on his pictures, and his willingness to wait for the best conditions for the view he was hoping to make. So these various quotes from letters and from the journals, I hope give you some sense of that transition that brings Adams from early tourist into accomplished mountaineer, and the way that that mountaineering experience then impacts his photography and his ultimate environmentalism. Okay, so the next point that I want to talk about that this book makes that we haven't really seen in the literature before is Adams's attention to his audience. And this is significant because early in his career, he didn't have much of a sense of who his audience was or how to make pictures for that audience. And over the period of 20 years or so that this book covers, through a number of experiences, he becomes more adept at thinking about who he's making pictures for, what that audience might be looking for, and in some cases, how to create a product that he can literally sell to that audience. So in this case, we're going to focus on a chapter of the book about a book that Adams produced in 1930 called Taos Pueblo. And this provides a really good example of how he's thinking about his audience. So in 1927, one of Adams's patrons, Albert Bender, invites him to go with Albert to northern New Mexico. Bender doesn't drive, and he needs someone to drive him from San Francisco to Santa Fe and Taos. And so Adams gets brought along on the trip as the driver. And Adams is elated at the opportunity. And truthfully, when he gets to northern New Mexico, he's so impressed both by all the photographic subject matter that's available. The landscape is really different. The culture of Spanish Americans and of the Pueblo Indians is very different from what he's seen before. But he also sees all of this potential. There aren't lots of photographers there when he arrives in the late 1920s. And unlike the Bay Area, which is really densely packed with other photographers, he feels like there may be opportunities to create photographs that have a market in northern New Mexico. So he begins to photograph the Pueblo Indians and tries to think of a way that he can create a commercial product out of these photographs. He talks with this patron, Albert Bender, who suggests that maybe the way to approach it is to find a writer and to pair writing together with his photographs. So what Adams does is he reaches out to Mary Austin. Mary Austin was older than Adams. She was already a well-established novelist, essayist, and activist on American Indian issues, and asks if she will write a piece to accompany his photographs. What we're seeing here is the opening page of her text in letterpress type for the book that they end up producing together. And so she writes about Taos Pueblo. Adams makes the photographs, and then they create a publication which is really remarkable and unusual for its time. And truthfully, it was so unusual that the format of it remains very unusual today. So what they decided to do was the paper that they used for the text that we're seeing here, some portion of it was given to William Dasonville, a neighbor of Adams's, who created photographic papers, handmade photographic papers. And Dasonville coated the paper for the book with photographic emulsion. Adams then printed his photographs on this paper, each photographed by hand in the darkroom, the way one does. And then those photographs were bound together with Austin's text into a large-scale, beautifully bound book in linen and leather. And this created a very unusual product. Usually if there are photographs in a book, they're tipped in, meaning that the photographs are produced separately and then glued onto the pages in the book. But in this case, Adams had this idea that if he could make the photographs truly integrate with the book and appear on the same paper as the text, it would create an unusual product that would be very attractive to book collectors. And the reason that he knows this is that during this period, he has joined two Bay Area book collecting clubs. One is the Book Club of California, and the other is the Roxburgh Club. And through Adams's participation in these social collecting clubs, he learns what the other members want, what kinds of things they're interested in, what do they collect, what makes something stand out, what are they willing to pay extra for. And through this, I mean, it's almost like reconnaissance, audience reconnaissance. He figures out how to produce a book that's going to be really appealing and especially spectacular to these collectors. And so he formulates this plan, and that becomes a major emphasis of this project. And so actually in the book, I talk a lot about how he produces and prices and markets the book, because all of that engagement with the audience is really a very critical turning point in Adams's career in thinking about not just how you make the photographs for an audience, but how you package them. And to that end, I want to read from these two letters. So here again, we're seeing primary source documents. These are copies of a letter from Ansel Adams to Mary Austin, the author, for his book, and then a return letter from Mary Austin to Ansel Adams. These are both copies that are in the Huntington Library in Pasadena, California. And that's one of the places that I did research, because that's where the Mary Austin archive is. So in order to read her letters and the communication between Adams and Austin, I went there. And I found this pair of letters, which I think is really very telling and helpful in understanding Adams's emphasis on the production, the pricing. So I'm going to start reading where we see the just above where we see the 1 and 2 on the page on the left-hand side. So he's writing to Austin, asking her on her thoughts about how to price the book. Quote, I have been carefully weighing in my mind the number of copies to be made and the price to charge. The practical phase of the venture is too serious to be secondary. Were I to be stuck and taken less than the book cost, it would be rather disastrous to our affairs. Here is the comparative specifications on the 2 propositions regarding the book. 1, 250 copies at $50 each will require the sale of 90 copies to meet the material cost of the edition. 2, 100 copies at $75 will require the sale of 45 copies to meet the material cost of the edition, end quote. To these suggestions, Austin replied, quote, 250 copies of a book at $50 a copy seems to me to be beyond belief, and 100 copies at $75 a copy leaves me gasping, end quote. Adams recommended that the latter might be the safer course of action, and they ultimately decided to make just 100 copies at the incredible price of $75 each, roughly equivalent to $1,175 in 2018. And Adams's gamble paid off because they actually sold out the entire edition. So Adams really understood these book collectors and that this luxe production was the thing that was going to sell. So that's a little bit about Adams and his audiences. And then next I want to talk about his work for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company. And this is something that scholars have never really paid that much attention to. It's acknowledged that Adams did commercial work, meaning work that he was hired to do for a client. But I think this particular job is really important and shows us the way that he learned a really important lesson that he brings through to his artwork, which is that if you can make pictures that are clear, simple, direct, impactful, then you can convey your message very effectively to your audience. And he learns this because while he's working for the Yosemite Park and Curry Company, he's reporting to the marketing department. And so the marketing and PR arm of YPCCO, as Yosemite Park and Curry Company is known, is responsible for attracting tourists into the valley because Yosemite Park and Curry Company provides all the lodging, they provide all the food. If you're going into the high country, they own all the stores that do the provisioning. And then they also, if you want to skate at the ice rink, they're the ones who rent you your ice skates. Or if you want to ski, they rent you your skis. So the marketing department is trying to attract American middle-class tourists to come to Yosemite and spend their vacation dollars on a trip to Yosemite National Park. So Adams gets hired to produce photographs like this one of the skating rink below Half Dome for use in all kinds of different purposes. So here we're seeing a window display where Adams's pictures are in the background of a probably San Francisco department store window where they're promoting that you can buy skis and snowshoes, but also the idea of then taking your skis and your snowshoes to Yosemite National Park to participate in winter sports activities. His pictures were also used on the cover of the paper menus that were produced each day for distribution in the dining room of the Ahwahnee Lodge, which was the grand and beautiful hotel in Yosemite National Park. And so here we're seeing Adams's image on the cover and then the inside of the menu for breakfast. So you can see all the delicious things on offer. His pictures were also used in the newspaper. So they accompanied press releases about stories that journalists might run about Yosemite National Park. So here, this is a story about how the winter, there was lots of snow. So the waterfalls are at especially high levels, and all of the pictures are by Ansel Adams. And then also sometimes those same pictures, the one on the upper right-hand corner of the news spread, Adams repurposes for a real photo postcard that can be purchased right in Yosemite Valley as a souvenir or a postcard to send to your family and loved ones back home. And I thought those postcards were so cool that we decided to use one of the postcards, the El Capitan, as an inset image on the cover of the book, because it gets at this idea of this commercial work being a really unique piece that this book addresses. Many of Adams's pictures went into this publication. It was a souvenir book about the Four Seasons in Yosemite National Park, and it emphasized the range of activities that were available to vacationers, including things like dog sledding and cross-country skiing. But this practice of working for a marketing department was where Adams learned that you needed to create pictures that were clear, that were direct, and where the message of the picture could not be misunderstood. So Adams takes that knowledge and pivots and uses it for his artwork. So for instance, this is Harold Ickes, who hires Adams to make pictures about the national parks, to create large-scale murals to be displayed in the Department of Interior building. And so Adams makes pictures like this one that we heard about at the beginning, or pictures like these, including the Lone Pine picture we also saw towards the beginning. And so Adams has now got this stylistic language based on all these years of experience, including working for Yosemite Park and Curry Company. And he's able to translate it into an art style that conveys the intensity of meaning that he wants to talk about. So I just want to read one more short passage to wrap up. And this is our fifth point from the book. And that's the way that Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, Adams's most famous picture, relates to this idea of learning all of these techniques that then in his 40s, in the early 1940s, he's able to finally produce photographs that say what he wants to say. So, Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico, 1941. By far, Adams's most famous photograph is Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Oft told, the story of its making is one of photographic legend. The creation of the Moonrise negative happened on a trip when he was accompanied by his son Michael and his friend Cedric Wright. And that's what we're seeing here. Ansel Adams on the right, Cedric Wright in the middle, and Michael Adams on the left. And this is them packing for this extended road trip on which Adams makes pictures for the national parks, but also makes his very famous Moonrise picture. They had been making photographs without much success in the Chama River Valley near Georgia O'Keeffe's Ghost Ranch in northern New Mexico. Driving back to Santa Fe, Adams hastily responded to what he saw before him. Quote, "In the east, the moon was rising over distant clouds and snow peaks, and in the west, the late afternoon sun glanced over a south-flowing cloud bank and blazed a brilliant white upon the crosses in the church cemetery," end quote. With the sun setting, he knew he had to act fast. Swerving his station wagon to the side of the road, he commanded his son and Wright to help him set up his 8 by 10-inch view camera. Tripod, camera body, lens board, lens, dark cloth, loaded film holder, and light meter had to be pulled out and assembled before he could frame and focus the view, made all the more urgent by the rapid descent of the November sun. In the frantic hustle, the light meter could not be found. Evaluating the scene before him, Adams miraculously remembered the luminance of the full moon, 250 candles per square foot, and was able to approximate an exposure for the scene. He released the shutter and captured the clouds, moon, and mountains beyond the little town of Hernandez. Before he could make a second backup negative, the sun dipped below the horizon and the opportunity was gone. With that single negative, Adams preserved a view that has become a photographic icon. The image, at its core, exhibits many of his mature stylistic elements. Adams filled the frame with a vast expanse of sky, the moon hovering above a bank of horizontally striated clouds, and a long, low chain of mountains. He placed the chapel and cross-filled graveyard of Hernandez in the middle ground, bounded by a shrub-filled plain. The picture features a panoramic sweep of landscape and compellingly asserts that this perspective, with its precise arrangement of human edifice within a monumental and impressive environment, is the critical viewpoint for observing the scene. The drama comes in part from the relative scale of the elements. The endless quality of the sky reminds viewers how small and seemingly insignificant we are in the expanse of the universe. All of these visual qualities serve to inspire in the viewer a sense of awe in the face of a spectacular and unique visual experience, an appreciation for the natural scene, and a feeling of amazement. Unlike the mountain pictures of the late 1920s and 1930s, found in his Parmelian Prints portfolio or his Sierra Club album, Moonrise clearly conveys Adams's intensity of experience, his message about the transcendental possibilities for people when they are immersed in nature, and his deep appreciation for the American landscape. This slide compares his final print to his proof print. The proof print on the right is a straight or unaltered printing from the negative with no darkroom work, such as dodging or burning, that allows the manipulation of exposure to select areas of the print. As such, it affords a view of Hernandez that is much closer to the one Adams originally observed, albeit in black and white. From this view of the landscape, he envisioned, or to use his parlance, visualized the finished artwork of Moonrise, Hernandez, New Mexico. Moonrise existed only in his imagination. He photographed a raw scene that he could transform in the darkroom into a symbol that would convey how he felt under a vast and beautiful New Mexico sky. By altering the relationship of the sky and the graveyard of the Hernandez Chapel to create a dark expanse over a shimmering village burial ground, Adams created from the raw material of the landscape an emotionally engaging image, one that borders on magic or mysticism. On that November day, Adams drew on more than 2 decades of wilderness exploration and photographic experience to create what would become his masterpiece. Deep and repeated contemplation had etched in him the value and meaning of immersing oneself in nature. Equally ingrained were lessons about making photographs that effectively convey an essential idea. Adams's early years had readied him for the scene he discovered along the highway as the sun set over northern New Mexico. Thank you. So I think now we have some time to take some questions.
We certainly do. Thank you so much. That was
You're welcome. My pleasure.
And I've heard you speak about Ansel Adams a number of times, and it doesn't ever get old. And it's a remarkable opportunity to see, I think, as I've said to you colloquially, how did Ansel Adams become Ansel Adams? So thank you. This is an opportunity for folks to jump in to the Q&A if they want to type a question, but I would like to start. Heather Harris will field those in a minute. Becky, I wonder, as somebody who started off well, I shouldn't say started, but when you were a graduate student and you were thinking about Ansel Adams, and now as chief curator at the CCP, what is the value of an archive in this enterprise? You know, we can go to museums, we can look at fine art prints, we can talk about form and line and qualities of production, but what does the archive give you that you couldn't do otherwise?
That's an excellent question. And where I work at the Center for Creative Photography, we have a gallery space where we can do exhibitions like people are used to seeing. But we are also a research center with over 200, nearly 300 now, archives. And those include archives of artists and of photographic galleries and of photographic organizations. Some of you may have heard of the Society for Photographic Education. Their archive is at the CCP. We have archives of scholars and curators. So those archives are made up of all of these original documents. For photographers, we sometimes have negatives or proof prints or printing instructions, or we have all of those wonderful portraits of Ansel Adams that I used in my presentation. And being able to go back to those primary source documents, those raw materials that were produced as Adams was living his life, as he was learning his practice, as he was interacting with people, gives scholars insight into what was happening. And I also consider many of Adams's early photographs part of that raw material, part of those primary source documents, because often those early pictures hadn't been consulted. But as you saw in the presentation, hearing his own words through letters or hearing LeConte talk about what camping trips were like from his journals provides us with a kind of granular sense that as a scholar, as a researcher, allowed me to better understand what was happening at this point 100 years ago or 90 years ago, and hear directly from the protagonist of the story, in this case, Ansel Adams. For instance, the Mary Austin Ansel Adams letters, I really expected that they would talk about American Indians and American Indian activism, and their letters include none of that. Adams is so focused on how to make and sell a beautiful book that all of the correspondence deals with that. So I had a hypothesis, and the original documentation corrected my hypothesis and gave me the evidence to understand where the emphasis actually was.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to jump in a little bit now. As Todd said, my name is Heather Harris, and I'm the Educational Programs Manager here. And we've had some questions rolling in as you took the time to answer that first one. So I'm going to go ahead and send some of those your way. So the first is, I captured the first, second, and fifth aspects of contribution to the understanding of Ansel Adams in a sentence, but didn't the third and the fourth. Would you care to kind of summarize those sort of ones in the middle?
Sure. So the third one was the idea about paying attention to audience. And so the notion that Adams began to think very consciously and intentionally about who he was making pictures for, what they were interested in, and how to create a product that they would be interested in. And that notion of audience actually runs throughout the book. So I just chose one example, the Taos Pueblo book, that illustrated it well. But you can actually, in the book, read about how he's thinking about that and how that gets more sophisticated over the course of his early years. And then the fourth point was the way in which his work for Yosemite Park and Curry Company taught him to make simple, straightforward, clear photographs that could allow him to convey a message through to his audience. And that point is really critical because we see a big change in his work around 1940. And in the years leading up to that big change, that's when he's working for this marketing department and learning how to make pictures that they want that are very clear and impactful. And so that then translates into his photographic artwork and allows him to achieve a new level of effectiveness of communication about his ideas of the importance of wilderness, the value of being in nature, and the kinds of transcendental possibilities there.
Great, thank you. And now our next question is, did Ansel Adams do anything meaningful with color?
Oh, that's a great question. So Adams didn't like color photography printing. So as we discussed with Moonrise, for instance, he wanted to be able to stand in the landscape, think about what the final artwork would look like, create a negative that would allow him to go into the darkroom and create that artwork. And he did it through a process of dodging and burning in the enlargement process that gave him tremendous control over contrast and luminosity and all the elements that he was invested in. With color printing, he didn't have that kind of control and he didn't like it. So he did make color negatives, both for himself, but then on a number of commercial jobs, perhaps most significantly for Kodak, Eastman Kodak Company. He, for years, helped produce the Kodak Coloramas for Grand Central Terminal, which were these massive enlargements of color transparencies. They were long, skinny, panoramic in format. And color, and they were lit from behind, and it was an advertisement for using Eastman Kodak products. He also worked with Polaroid Company and made color for Polaroid as well. But then, I mean, he made color for a number of different commercial assignments. But during his lifetime, the printing process to him never felt adequate to match the kind of color that he could get in positive transparency. And so I suspect that if he were living today and had access to digital technology where you can literally change pixel by pixel the saturation or the color or the brightness, he would be reinvested in the possibility of color photography because he would have the kind of control that he never had during his lifetime.
And I think you're kind of touching on it there, but this leads very nicely into our next question about how did technological advances in photography affect or influence Adams' aesthetics as he matured as an artist?
So Adams was a real technique. He was really invested in technique and in fact wrote a series of technical manuals, some of which are still used today. He was self-taught. He dropped out of formal schooling around the age of 12. And so all the science, all the chemistry that he used for photography, he learned on his own. He, through the period that we discussed where he's becoming a mountaineer, he's also rapidly advancing through more and more expensive and higher quality cameras. So even in the 20s, he's upgrading his camera equipment and lens equipment so that he's got the most high quality materials that he can afford. And so quite early in his career, he's got a kind of technical mastery that then informs all the rest of his career. I have had questions about whether or not this change in his style to the more dramatic and the more contrasty could relate to technical changes, or somebody's even suggested maybe it relates to his eyesight going bad. But we see that change happen around 1941 when Adams is just 39 years old. And it is true that there's a big change in the way black and white photographic papers look, because we begin to add optical brighteners to them, which are those bright white elements that fluoresce under black light. If you've ever gone to a bar or a club that has black light and your socks glow or your white t-shirt glows, it's optical brighteners that make it glow. And so we started to put that in black and white photographic paper, and that does change the entire field and a kind of appreciation for greater contrast and brighter whites. But that doesn't happen until around 1950. So there are technical things that are related to changes in aesthetics, but not so much with Adams and that big shift in his style around 1940.
Wonderful. And so I've got one more question and then actually a comment, and I'm going to go ahead and close the Q&A. I think those have been up there for a while, and so I'll let you address those and then we'll wrap up. So the first question, some of Ansel Adams' most famous images depict a supposedly pristine landscape of Yosemite National Park, promoting this false notion of wilderness. And these images only exist as they do because of the violent and forced removal of indigenous people and his own white privilege. Just wondering if any research or publications exist on this issue, specifically in regards to Ansel Adams.
There was a, I don't know if it was like a seminar or a panel discussion that resulted in a book that was about rethinking Ansel Adams. And I can't recall if there was a paper in that group that addresses that specifically, but that's the only potential for that kind of content. There really has not been very much critical examination, and particularly not from the perspective of the kind of the forcible removal of Indian peoples from Yosemite and Adams's presentation of Yosemite. Adams was aware of and thought about the way that the Indian people who lived in Yosemite had been treated, and the way in which their populations had been decimated, and the way that they had been evicted from their own lands. And I think that is in part the reason that he reacts so strongly to the Pueblo Indians, who have had a kind of constant habitation on their own lands, which for him as a Californian feels very foreign when he sees it for the first time. I think his depiction of peopled spaces, especially in Yosemite, for him comes very much from his training in the Sierra Club, and has to do with an idea of creating a grassroots response to wilderness protection. And that goes back to John Muir, who's very much a 19th century figure, who developed the Sierra Club as a hiking club for the Sierra Nevada, but also a watchdog group. And their premise was the way you protect wilderness is by using it. And that the way you create a group of people who will be invested in protecting wilderness is by being in the landscape. And so Adams's approach to activism was always one of use and appreciation, not of complete conservation or protection. So there is something of a dichotomy that people see in the way that he presented landscapes as very pristine, even if they were peopled. But I think it relates to the way that he was trained to be an activist and an environmentalist.
Okay, thank you for that. So our final comment is actually a compliment, but an amazing presentation of an artist's work and methodology, but also an amazing example of how to beautifully construct and support a thesis. And I think as an academic university, an academic art museum, we are really happy to sort of watch that transformation as we're training young scholars. So that was an appreciation by one of our attendees that she had for your work. And we certainly appreciate all that you do, and we appreciate you being here with us this evening and giving us this in-depth look at Ansel Adams' early work. Yeah. So do you have anything else, Todd?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Senf. This was a delight. Like I said at the beginning of the talk, we really wish you could have been here in person. But if you wouldn't mind holding up the book one more time, I'll do a plug for you. Get your hands on that book from your favorite local bookseller if you can. And we do hope that there's an opportunity for you to visit Morgantown in the near future. So
yeah, likewise. I'm sorry not to be there to clink wine glasses with all of you now, but I so appreciate the invitation, Todd and Heather, and it was a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the nice compliment. It's fun to put together a talk, and I'd never done it quite like this, and so this was a different way, an experiment of presenting the information, so I'm glad it came across, and maybe I'll just go a little slower on those 5 points next time.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you very much, and everyone be well and look out for more programming from the Art Museum. Have a good evening.
Thank you.